welcome to Moments with Marianne. I'm so delighted we're spending this time here today. We have a very inspiring show coming right up with special guest Dr. Stephen Southwick, and he's here to talk to us about his new book, Resilience, the Science of Mastering Life's Greatest Challenges. Now, Dr. Stephen is a Glenn H. Greenberg Professor of Psychiatry, PTSD and Resilience at Yale University Medical School and Yale Child Study Center. He's a Deputy Director at the Clinical Neuroscience Division of the Veteran Affairs National Center for PTSD and the Adjunct Professor of Psychiatry, Mount Sinai School of Medicine. His interests include psychology, neurobiology of psychological trauma, PTSD, and resilience of stress. Dr. Stephen has worked with a wide range of trauma survivors, including combat veterans, civilian children and adults with PTSD, and high-functioning stress-resilient former prisoners of war. Dr. Stephen has also worked with active duty Special Forces soldiers and Navy SEALs. So let's welcome to the show Dr. Stephen Southwick.
Well, thank you. It's great to be with you.
What a pleasure it is to have you here. And my goodness, your book is just absolutely amazing. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Well, I have to ask you, what started you on the path of even studying resilience?
Well, my colleague Dennis Charney and I had, with many other colleagues, had been studying post-traumatic stress disorder for years, largely with combat veterans, but with many civilians and children as well who had been severely traumatized and had developed some symptoms. And we also were very interested in how is it that some people, even when they have symptoms, or they may not have symptoms, are able to make the best of a bad situation, if you will, and soldier on and deal with adversity in pretty constructive ways. So we began we decided, well, let's find some really extremely resilient individuals and see if they can tell us what they do when they're trying to negotiate stress. So we interviewed a large number of former prisoners of war from Vietnam, and then we interviewed Special Forces instructors because we thought, gee, they undoubtedly could tell us something about how they train their soldiers to be both physically and emotionally resilient. And then we interviewed a large number of civilian men, women, and children who had been through difficult circumstances and had done well nevertheless. And very briefly, what we noticed after doing many of these interviews is we kept hearing some of the same themes over and over again. And we categorized these into 10 different factors. Of course, there could be more than 10, but these are the themes that we kept hearing over and over again as to how resilient individuals negotiate traumatic and stressful situations. So that's how we got started, and quite honestly, it's been a remarkable privilege, both interviewing people who have been through, everyone really who's been through highly traumatic situations, and then to find out how people deal with it. And as a result, I have all of these wonderful role models in my head.
Mm-hmm. Well, and what's great is, there's so much positive just information from your book that I think that if people go, well, I don't think I'm really a resilient person. I really appreciate that you have a ray of hope for them.
Yes, I think what's very important is for people to understand that they are far more resilient than they know. And there's a wonderful book about childhood development by a professor, Ann Maston, University of Minnesota, and the title of the book is Ordinary Magic. And I believe what she's referring to is that within us, each of us has a natural reservoir of resilience that we may not be aware that we have, and that often during times of real trauma and stress, we become acquainted with that in some way. And resilience is partly about understanding and recognizing that that's there, and also that any of us can train ourselves to become more resilient. Really, resilience in many ways is a set of skills, habits, and can be learned.
Well, how does, because I know your book talks a lot about optimism.
Hmm.
How does that play a part in all of this?
Well, optimism is I'm not sure I'd say essential, but it's close to essential. Maybe it is essential. Optimism is in part the belief that things will get better, that there's light at the end of the tunnel. There's a huge science literature on the relationship between optimism and how long you live. Optimists tend to live longer. There are better medical outcomes. They tend to be a little more creative. And one of the reasons is that when we are engaged in positive emotions, it tends to open up our perspective. So there's a theory called broaden build, and that is that, see, when we're afraid and when we're threatened and when we have negative, it tends to shut down our focus, which is understandable. We all do this. It's about protection. But if we can become more optimistic, we will end up feeling more creative. We'll attract other people, so we'll get a lot more social support in general. We tend to then use more active coping as opposed to passive coping, which is associated with resilience. And you can actually learn to become more optimistic. It's not easy, but you can. And there's a therapy called learned optimism. And it really, a big part of this is learning to recognize how you are explaining events in your life to yourself. So, for example, the pessimist, might flunk a test in algebra and say to themselves, "Oh my gosh, this is terrible. I'm not smart. I'm stupid. I'm not good in any subjects. I'll never get into college. This is ruining my life." So what the pessimist has done is that they have catastrophized, made it really bad, and they've generalized it to many, if not all, aspects of their life. An optimist can flunk the same test and say, "Oh, this is not good, but maybe I didn't study enough. Maybe this isn't my strength. I'll be okay in other areas," and so forth. So the optimist has not catastrophized, has not made it bigger than it need be, and has not generalized it to all areas of their life. Now, it turns out that this is what learned optimism, one of the therapies, is largely about. It's about recognizing how you are explaining things to yourself and learning to question, well, am I really not going to get into college because I flunked this one test, and so forth. It's almost as if you take the perspective of a friend who is looking at or observing your behavior, and the friend might say, "Oh, that's not likely," that sort of thing. So optimism is really essential. It's a fuel of sorts, because when you're in tough times, it's important to understand that there is light at the end of the tunnel, and that is there a way that I can reframe what's going on? Yes, it's difficult, and maybe it's horrendous, and maybe there's almost no way to see a silver lining. But if there is any opportunity to do that, that can be very helpful. Yeah.
I love how in your book, and I've heard you at different talks as well, discuss how POWs use optimism and even humor during the time they're being held hostage, and so you look at all of this and how it affects them, just their just outlook on everything.
Humor is very important. It's a bit neglected in the resilience literature, but humor. Most of the resilient people we talk with talk about humor as being important. And one thing about humor, if you think about it, it's a way to look at and confront, in a way, something that's difficult or painful, but you're reframing it. You're looking at it. You're not avoiding it, because avoidance does not work in general. Avoidance is really behind the anxiety disorders like panic disorder and generalized anxiety disorder. And PTSD used to be an anxiety disorder. It still, in my mind, is to some degree. But when we avoid what we're afraid of, it just doesn't work. So when you think about humor, in a way you are looking at the difficult situation, but you're looking at it from a different angle. You're essentially making fun of it, so that you're not completely avoiding it. Now, there are people who turn everything into humor, and that may be a form of avoidance. But in general, humor in the context of stress can be really helpful.
Well, in your book, you talk about some of the major differences, the way that optimists and pessimists see the world. And I love how you just explained how with an optimist, it's as a friend is kind of saying, hey, that's not true, or, kind of looking at that silver lining. What would the pessimists more see?
Well, the pessimists see we are all biologically geared toward or designed to look for and assess threatening stimuli in our environment. So in general, most of us, if there are negative stimuli or threatening stimuli, as well as neutral stimuli and even some positive stimuli in our environment, we will preferentially go to the negative or to the threatening. And that's about survival. So that we all have that. One of the problems with when I say problems, it makes life more challenging and not as enjoyable, is the pessimist will see all of those negative stimuli, but have a difficult time letting them go. So the optimist actually tends to see as much of the negative as the pessimist, but however they do this, they don't dwell on it, they don't ruminate it on the same way, and they're able to let it go, or let go the negative stimuli that are not actually all that relevant. So they're, I think, maybe better able to assess what's truly relevant from a negative standpoint and what's not. And so it's not easy. I mean, all of us, I've been somewhat pessimistic during portions of my life, and you have to work at it. It's good to be around optimistic people because emotions are infectious. There's some amazing data looking at populations of people and how having optimistic friends or colleagues, family, and so forth can affect your own level of optimism or pessimism. So that can be important too. And another interesting approach is to act as if you are optimistic. It's a little bit like fake it till you make it. So how would optimists, do you imagine, how would optimists actually act in this particular situation? Because our mood can be affected by how we think enormously, but also how we act. We can get feedback from both ways.
I think that's just, so encouraging for people who maybe feel like, gosh, they can only see the glass half full or half empty, So it's good for people to understand that they can, developing more optimism is something that can be done.
Yes. It takes work, but it can definitely be done.
Well, and so, you talk about reframing trauma and, in different reasons we would do that. Can you kind of expand on that a little bit more for us? Because I really want our listeners to get an idea of why we would first reframe the trauma and how that would help us become more resilient.
Yeah. And this is I want to make sure that people understand that when someone has gone through an overwhelming trauma, it just may not be possible to do this. But at least at some point, as things settle down, it often is possible to reframe it at least in some way. So one of the questions that one might ask is there any, quote, opportunity in this situation? Is there any opportunity for growth? Is there any opportunity, for example, some people develop what is called a survivor mission. And this is fairly extreme, but very inspiring to watch. So an individual might take their trauma and use that experience of pain and so forth, turn it into a mission of sorts, often in the service of a social good. So an example would be Mothers Against Drunk Drivers. Mothers who experience the death of their children or the injury of their children due to drunk drivers formed this tremendous organization that has done much good in the world and helped to address this terrible problem of drunk driving. We have a friend named Jerry White who was a student at Brown University, and he was doing a junior year abroad, I believe, and he was hiking in the Golan Heights in Israel and stepped on a landmine. And he almost died. He became depressed and so forth. But eventually, and we talk about this in the book, eventually through a prolonged process of searching and so forth, he developed a survivor mission. And he used his knowledge of losing his leg, the pain of losing the leg, the emotional and physical pain and so forth, and he, along with another colleague who lost both of his legs to a landmine, they formed the International Landmine Survivors Network, which eventually won the Nobel Peace Prize. So for him, he wouldn't wish this on anybody. He wouldn't wish it on himself again. But he somehow, and he talks about it in the book and so forth, was able to take that trauma and turn it into a mission and a pursuit that he continued for many years and turned it into a, quote, social good.
Yeah, and I believe that's one of the things that Princess Diana had back in the day.
Yes, she did. And actually, Jerry knew Princess Diana pretty well and found her to be quite a remarkable person.
Mm-hmm. This is an amazing story, and I thank you for sharing that, because it really does give our listeners a place of reference when they look at this. Going, a lot of people, if they lost a limb, they could easily get depressed and think life is kind of over, or things aren't going to go the way that they had wished.
Well, most people probably will get depressed on some level, and Jerry got depressed. But he was eventually able to reframe, if you will, at least part of this traumatic experience. Actually, my brother, who was a great athlete and great outdoors person, lost his leg about 5 years ago, and I introduced him to Jerry White, actually. My brother is an extremely resilient person, and he has used this to, he gives talks to various prosthetic organizations. He gives talks to others who have lost limbs and so forth, not saying that he's unbelievably resilient or anything, but just sharing some of his experiences and letting others share their experience and compare notes and so forth. Because one of the most important factors in resilience is social connectedness and social support. And part of one of my colleagues did a study, a good friend did a study of returning Iraq-Afghanistan veterans, and over again, the trauma literature has shown that having a good social support network helps to protect against the development of depression and PTSD. It can't not necessarily get completely rid of it, but it really does help. And it turns out that there are a number of elements within social support. So I could give you emotional support, which is very helpful. I could give you what's called instrumental support, which is resources or money or whatever if you didn't have it, or informational support, advice. But it turns out for returning Iraq-Afghanistan veterans and for many different people, the most important element within social support was feeling understood. And it's a kind of a long discussion, but this idea of making sure that your social network is really strong, that there's at least one person in your life who would drop anything and come to your aid, and you would do the same for them or someone, because it's a two-way street, of course. But this having a strong social network has remarkable effects on your stress system, helping to tone it down, and it's related to all sorts of positive indicators of mental and physical health.
Well, and on that note, how important are role models also in that dynamic?
Well, role models are very important, and we noticed that pretty much all of the many resilient people we've interviewed had role models, and they can be from your family, they can be friends, they can be people you've never met. And for example, there is a young woman who we interviewed. We actually interviewed her first when she was in high school, and she was born with a neurological condition that made it hard for her to walk. It's a tough condition, but that didn't stop her. She is just this beacon of optimism and resilience. She ended up being a Paralympic gold medalist. She ended up being the valedictorian of her high school class. She got early acceptance to Yale. She was on the Yale swimming team. She graduated summa cum laude from Yale. I mean, it's unbelievable. And many people would really be discouraged by having this condition, but not Deborah. And she, as a role model, she's a role model for many people, including me. So, for example, in high school, she would swim an average of 26 miles per week for practice. 26 miles per week. Get up in the morning at 5, practice, that sort of thing. So I like to exercise a lot, and I like to swim. I'm not a great swimmer, but I like to swim. And so I'll be swimming along, and about half mile or so, 3/4 of a mile, I think that's probably enough. But then Deborah comes to mind. 26 miles a week. Are you kidding? Come on, don't wimp out. So it helps me, push on a little bit further. And there are so many, I can't tell you how many great role models pop into my mind whenever, and at various times, particularly when I'm facing something that's unpleasant or adverse.
Well, and you talk about that in your book about facing fears and how important that is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We all basically naturally back off from fear. We avoid things that make us afraid. It's natural. Unfortunately, it does not work in general. So we found that one way to increase resilience is to learn to face your fears. Now, again, this is not easy, but first one must recognize the fact that, yes, I am afraid of this. Unfortunately, if I give in to all of my fears, I can really limit my life quite a bit. And what we found from the various people who we interviewed, particularly the Special Forces, for example, they talk about reframing fear so that the idea is that to learn that fear is actually not the enemy. Fear is actually your friend, in a way, in that it is alerting you to the fact that something is not quite right, that something is awry. The problem comes if you let fear hang around for too long. Then you can get into sort of a panicky state. And in a panicky state, people just don't make good, rational decisions. So one of the important things is to recognize, well, what am I afraid of? And then what the Special Forces would recommend, and I think it's great advice, is to learn as much as you can about what it is you're afraid of. In other words, don't avoid it. And if it requires learning some skills to make it through that fear, then try your best to learn those skills. And also to confront what you fear with somebody you're close with, friends, if you can do that. So there's a way that fear is actually a good thing. It's trying to protect me, but I don't want it to rule my life and to limit my life so that I just don't venture out and do lots of the things that I otherwise might do. So learning to face your fears is very important. And as I said before, at the heart of many of the anxiety disorders is avoidance. because and it turns out that most of the psychotherapy treatments for post-traumatic stress disorder involve facing what it is that is scaring you or that is frightening or that is traumatic. So not avoiding, but actually facing with a therapist. And in fact, one of my favorite Buddhist teachers, Thich Nhat Hanh, talks about in mindfulness, which I think is a very helpful skill to learn. Thich Nhat Hanh might say, "Hello, fear. I know you. I recognize you. I am going to welcome you, and I am going to embrace you and take care of you like a mother takes care of her baby." So one thing about mindfulness is that I'm not pushing thoughts away. I'm noticing what's, we all have this monkey mind. Our brain is, always crazy thoughts. I'm noticing them, but not becoming them necessarily. And the point is, I'm not running from them. I'm not trying to shove them away, because that tends not to work. I'm going to deal with them.
And face those head on. And I really like how you've incorporated mindfulness in this as well, because it really allows a person to be in the present moment and think clearly through what's going on.
Yeah, I think it's a really, if I were in a position to recommend to school systems, I would recommend that children, grade school or whatever, learn mindfulness. I just think it's a great skill.
Yeah. I mean, my goodness, there's so much in your book. It's filled with so many great resources. I mean, we haven't even touched the tip of the iceberg on that. I wanted to ask, and I'm sure you probably get tons of people that just use this book. Who do you feel can benefit from reading this book?
Well, it's interesting. Initially, we felt that psychiatrists and psychologists, social workers, but we've kind of come to just, I'm not quite sure how, but we found that different people who have gone through trauma have felt it to be helpful. I think we various members of the military and actually police force and fire department have let us know that it's been helpful to them. I think it could be helpful for most people. It might be a little bit intimidating because of the examples are special forces and so forth and POWs and highly resilient people, but we did that. Basically, the advice that the people are giving in the book can be used by anybody, and because we all go through difficult times. Now, our traumas might not be quite as extreme. It doesn't matter, because one thing we did, we decided that when we interviewed these individuals, we would try to get out of the way, let them tell their story, let them tell the reader what they think helps them get through difficult circumstances. And then we went to the psychosocial science literature, psychology literature, and the neuroscience literature, looking at the brain, and we found a lot of support for each of these 10 factors or each of these 10 approaches to helping build resilience. But it all started with resilient people telling us what they did, and then our looking in the science literature and say, hey, there's a lot of support from this in the science, and it's not a mystery, and anyone can become more resilient, and there is a science to it, and it's like skills development. It takes practice, it takes work, but there is a science to it.
Well, it's easy to see that this book would be a great benefit for parents, anyone who's dealing with children, people who have gone through traumatic situations, people looking to, for like a personal development build, because it's a resource that will serve them in every area of their life.
Thank you. Yeah. Well,
good job on it.
Thank you very much. Well, it was really the people we interviewed, to be honest. That's really what got got us going on this, and they're really the experts.
Yeah, well, you guys obviously saw the pattern and was able to piece it together, and you've got a great outline there for our listeners to use on how to go ahead and develop more resilience in their lives. Dr. Stephen, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I enjoy it, and it's my favorite topic, and I just hope that people can benefit in some way.
Well, thank you, Dr. Stephen. It has been such a pleasure to spend this time with you and, of course, to talk about your new book, Resilience. Now, if you're looking to pick up your own copy of Resilience, you can at Amazon and Barnes & Noble. And don't forget to drop into your local indie bookstore. And if they don't have it on the shelves, ask for them to order it. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I would like to thank everyone for tuning in. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne. And remember, make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary. A recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Moments with Marianne airs every Thursday, Friday, and Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Mountain Time. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.